Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Bonnie Brzozowski. I'm a public services librarian at the Corvallis-Benton County Public Library. Welcome to our event tonight, Transforming Mary's Peak. This is the second in the 2024 Liz and Bob Frankel Environment and Hiking Spring Webinar Series. The theme for this year's series is Mary's Peak, so we're going to learn all about this iconic local backdrop. There are two other virtual events in addition to this one that are part of this series. On Tuesday, March 14th, the event was Mary's Peak Transformed, where we learned how human activities over the past 200 years have already transformed Mary's Peak. And we also learned a bit about who this mysterious Mary might be. You can watch that video at the link that I'm going to share in the chat to you right now. If I can remember how it works. There we go. So there it is in the chat if you want to give it a watch. It will also be on the library's YouTube page very soon. And then on Thursday, May 9th, that will be the last in this series at 7 p.m. as well. It's Imagining Mary's Peak, so looking at the future of Mary's Peak. You can learn more about the May event as well as register for it at this next link that I'm also about to share in the chat. Registration is required to get a link to attend. You'll also be sent a recording of the event. So if you're not able to attend, go ahead and register and you'll get a recording of it to watch at your convenience. As I'm sure you've probably noticed, we're using Zoom tonight. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation and we'll try to answer some of those at the end. Usually you click or tap on the question mark to submit your questions, though it's a little different for everyone, but I think you'll find it if you just look around your window there. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over now to Dave Eckert. He's the program chair for the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club. He's going to tell us more about the series co-sponsors, as well as our fantastic presenters. So thanks, Dave. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, Bonnie. We're going to start with a quiz. And let's see how much you know. Not Bonnie, I mean everybody. And so the question is, how many peaks or how many summits are on Mary's Peak? Raise your hand if you know. Oh, I can't see you. Okay, so you'll probably look at this picture and say, well, there are three. There are three summits. Well, actually, there's four. And you see three on here. You see the main summit. You see West Point in the background. And between them, a little bit to the right, you see the middle summit. They all have communication towers on them. And then there's the fourth one, which has different names, none of them official. Some call it the East Summit and some call it the False Summit. I prefer the East Summit. And it's right over the parking lot. It's right on the south side of the summit parking lot. You cannot see it in this picture. So that's the end of that quiz. So let's go on to the next slide. And this is the Liz and Bob Frankel Hiking and Environmental Spring Lecture Series. Liz and Bob Frankel were advocates and promoters of Mary's Peak. They were the ones who got me interested in Mary's Peak, and they directed me to do something about Mary's Peak. And then they gave, when they passed away, left a lot of money for an interpretation plan, which you'll hear about in the next on May 9th presentation. So they have did so much in their life for the environment around the whole Willamette Valley, and even actually across the country, and very involved with hiking also. We are in the Corvallis and Mary's Peak area. We are in the land called Champinafu. It's the land of the Ampinafu Kalapuya, this is their homeland, has been since time immemorial, going back tens of thousands of years. That includes on the far west end, the east and north side of Mary's Peak. And many of the Ampinafu live in the Confederated Tribes, the Grand Ronde, or with the Confederated Tribes, the Siletz Indians. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Mary's Peak group of the Sierra Club, the Corvallis Benton County Public Library and by the Marys Peak Alliance of Afrana. And we're deeply indebted to all three organizations to making this happen and being able to provide this service to you. I also want to encourage you, if you are like Marys Peak, is to go on to the vimeo.com at some point and type in Marys Peak field trip and watch the 1 hour video that we made in 2020 when the pandemic started. And it's still every bit as true today as it was then. So I promise you'll enjoy it. This is the fourth in the series of the webinars that we have done. The program went on well before that, but we turned to webinar format with the pandemic. And the first one was called the Gift Series, and that based on where the Frankels gave financial gifts in their estate to three areas: Jackson Fraser Wetland, Marys Peak, and Bald Hill Natural Area. The second one was called Beavalis, about the beavers of Corvallis and even beavers around the world, on how they could be one of our most important answers to the climate change issue and how important they are to our own personal well-being. And then last year, it was reviving the wetlands series, and we did 3 wetlands in the Mid-Willamette Valley that were very important, and how they're being revived. So this year is Transforming Marys Peak, and look at these two pictures, one above the other. Phil Hayes did the 2016 picture to mimic the 2010, taken from the same place. Look how different they are. You won't. It's hard to believe it's the same viewpoint. And you can see there's very few trees up there in 1910. All of a sudden, it's almost all trees. In 2016, you can't even see the main summit from there. So it's been transformed, and we're still transforming it. So as Bonnie said, that make sure you do go on what she left in the chat. And if you haven't seen Marys Peak Transformed, you can see how and why it was transformed. And then we have now about what's happening now, literally now. And the next one is how can we imagine Marys Peak in terms of a plan? That's on May 9th. And so all those circles are places that are potential places for interpretation of Marys Peak, to have people understand Marys Peak, understand how we impact Marys Peak, and try to understand what is it we want, because we actually have choices. So tonight, we're having 4 wonderful speakers. And I'll be introducing each of you individually when they're about to speak. But the 4 talks, the first one was Recovering System Process in Marys Peak Creeks by Kathleen Wesley of the Marys River Watershed Council. The second is Restoring the Ridgeline Lookout, which almost nobody knows about, on Marys Peak Road by Scott Hopkins of the BLM. The third one is Restoring the Marys Peak Summit Meadows on the meadows on all 4 of the summits by Doug Glavich of the Forest Service. And finally, Michelle Holman of the Forest Service. We talking about reducing essentially the size of the Marys Peak communication site. So this is a unique series of presentations. And I do want to remind you, like Bonnie said, please ask your questions through the Q&A. You write them in as you're listening, because these are 4 very different talks. And if you wait to the end to try to type in your question, you know, a lot of us don't remember. So just type them in as you're thinking about them and submitting them, so that Bonnie can take them and then put them in order, so she can then ask the questions at the very end. I'm going to stop sharing at this point and ask Kathleen if she can come on. And what I'm going to do is introduce Kathleen as Kathleen enters her video. So Kathleen Wesley has worked with the Marys River Watershed Council for 13 years, leading efforts in the council's restoration, education, and outreach programs. She is focused on Marys Peak tributary creeks as they are the highest priority streams in the whole Marys River watershed for improving the health and function of that system. Kathleen will share information on restoration activities the council has undertaken over the last 20 years in the three primary river tributaries flowing from Marys Peak, and she will tell you what those are. So, Kathleen, take it away.
Thank you, Dave. I'll be periodically looking over to my left. So just to let y'all know, that's where my slideshow is on another monitor. And my apologies if I glitch out. My internet has been unstable today, so we'll hope that it lasts. I did want to note the photograph in this first slide. It is a picture of a headwater off of Marys Peak, one of the creeks there. And you'll notice the large wood. This is on Siuslaw National Forest lands. This is a sign of a healthy stream, having that large wood component in the creek. So we'll be talking more about that as we move along. Hey, for those of us that have seen the presentation from last month, Phil Hayes shared a couple of older historic maps. And I wanted to just revisit those briefly to put our focus a little bit downstream of the peak, downslope onto what these maps are telling us about the Marys River. The first one here at the top is the Gibbs-Starling map of 1851, and it notes Marys Peak. It calls it Mount Snelling, but it does note that Marys River flows directly from the peak. The second map, the John Preston map of 1856, labels the peak as Marys Peak, and then labels South Fork Marys River, which is what essentially we now know as Greasy Creek, and the unlabeled main stem. Both of those headwaters are coming off of Marys Peak. And I think what that tells us from these early mappers is that they understood the importance of the tributaries flowing from Marys Peak as it relates to the Marys River and those critical headwater streams in terms of their contribution to the river system. And a note also that in about this time, some notes from these maps indicated that the peak was snow-capped for about 8 months of the year. So that's a substantial change from what we see today. And we'll talk about the importance of that. Back in 2010, Marys River Watershed Council was approved to join the Meyer Memorial Trust Model Watershed Program. We were one of a few watershed councils in the Willamette Valley chosen for that decade-long program. And part of the requirement for being in the Model Watershed Program was to choose focal tributaries to the Marys River that we would put our restoration efforts primarily into. And as you can see from this model map, this is the cutthroat trout habitat suitability map that really looked at what conditions were going to be most supportive of the anchor habitats or full life history of cutthroat trout in the Marys River watershed. The cutthroat trout is our top aquatic predator. We do have other salmonids that come into the system, but the cutthroat trout is really our full life history from spawning on through. And so those 4 systems or subbasins of the Marys River watershed are Beaver Creek in the south, which does not flow off of Marys Peak. It actually comes off of Table Mountain primarily. And the other 3 are all tributaries that flow from the flanks of Marys Peak. Greasy Creek, Woods Creek, and Tum Tum River. And we chose those systems because they have the highest possibility to be healthy, functional systems for cutthroat trout. But that doesn't mean that we haven't had human impacts over the decades that have caused some issues in those systems, and we'll talk about those. So I'm going to focus in even a little further than those larger sub-basins and look specifically at Rock Creek. This is the area here that flows off of the east flank of Mary's Peak, and it is a tributary to Greasy Creek. And the entire Greasy Creek and Rock Creek system really is the most critical tributary in the Marys River watershed for contributions of cold water, which is an essential component for aquatic organisms in Western Oregon streams. And then we have Woods Creek in the Middle Marys subbasin that flows off of the northeast flank of Mary's Peak. And then Shot Pouch Creek, which is a tributary to the Tum Tum River, and it flows off of the northwest flank of Mary's Peak. And we picked these streams, as I said, because they are rated very highly in the model, but even more specifically, they are the streams that have the opportunity for snowpack contribution of cold, slow, over those warmer months, release of that cold water to the system, which again is just so critical. And once we had decided that these were going to be the streams that the council was going to focus on for major focused restoration and systemic restoration, really looking at the entire systems, we conducted rapid bioassessments in those tributaries, which consists of walking the streams, snorkel surveys to look at fish distribution and abundance, and really assessing what are the conditions, what are the limiting factors, those factors that limit the health and function of the system for aquatic organisms. Again, really focusing in on what do cutthroat trout need. Because if you have that apex predator in your system in a healthy population, then you know the rest of that trophic cascade or those other portions of the food web and system are functioning well. So those rapid bioassessments were conducted starting in 2006. And so we've really been at this for nearly 20 years in terms of conducting first assessments and then restoration in these systems. The three primary limiting factors that I want to talk about this evening, and they are seen in all of these tributaries that we're looking at here, are elevated summer stream temperatures, which is not unique to the Marys. It's pretty standard to be a limiting factor in Western Oregon streams. And then we have channel simplification and lack of floodplain connection, and fish passage barriers. And most of those are due to some human impacts. One of those impacts is in that elevated summer temperatures has to do with how the streams are used, or how the land is used, farming, livestock, early logging out along riparian buffers that stopped wood from falling in. And you can see some examples here at the bottom, and then up at the top, a bank pullback to deal with some of this eroding bank, some livestock fencing, some planting, all of which is to address some of those issues. Another primary limiting factor is the lack of floodplain connection. And mostly that has to do with the lack of large wood that's no longer present in that riparian corridor to fall in and push the stream onto its floodplain, helping that connection to persist rather than allowing the stream to just channelize and cut down to bedrock eventually. And then fish passage barriers. We can see here on the left are the befores and on the right are the afters. On the top, these are the fish ladders that were put in the Rock Creek watershed, this Corvallis City municipal watershed. And then in the bottom, this is in Shot Pouch Creek, where we had a culvert way undersized. Obviously, the fish can't make that jump, replaced with a bridge. So many details to go into on each of these streams and the projects that we've conducted, both that have been completed and planned for the future. Not enough time to go into all that, but happy to share with any of you in the future on any of our projects in Shot Pouch, Woods, and Rock Creeks. Thank you.
Hey, Dave, you're muted.
Okay, sorry, I did all that introduction. No, okay. Okay, moving on to Scott Hopkins. Thank you, Kathleen. We'll get back with the Q&A later on with you. So Scott Hopkins is going to be talking about restoring the Ridgeline Lookout on Marys Peak Road. That's question number 2. How many people know what Ridgeline Lookout is on Marys Peak Road? Well, there's a reason you don't know. Well, Scott Hopkins is a wildlife biologist at the Marys Peak Field Office in the Northwest Oregon District of the Bureau of Land Management, otherwise known as the BLM. Scott has worked for the BLM in Western Oregon for 35 years. His primary duties include monitoring at-risk wildlife species such as the northern spotted owls, marbled murrelets, and red tree voles, while also collaborating with other BLM specialists to design and implement habitat restoration treatments on BLM lands. Much of that work has focused on the BLM lands in Benton County, including the BLM parcels that surround Marys Peak. Scott, like with everyone, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
Okay, now let me hopefully find my okay. Let's see, where am I at?
Well, you want to turn your video on, and because we can see the slides.
Yeah, here we go.
There you go. So we can see your slides. It's okay.
It switched screens on me. Okay. All right, let's go. So we'll start off with a Google Earth view from the southeast here. This is to the southeast of Highway 34, looking to the northwest at Marys Peak. So you can see Highway 34 going across there as you travel from Philomath, which is on the right, to Alsea, which would be on the left. And as you come over the summit of Highway 34, the Marys Peak Road takes off, going up towards Marys Peak, the peak up there. And so if you get about 2.5 miles up that road, you'll come around the bend and there'll be some nice stonework and a widened area and a little pull off. And that has been something we have called Ridgeview Overlook, Ridgeline Overlook. It's also had some other names. And that's where we're talking about here tonight. So let me see if I can get to my first slide. And hopefully this is gonna, okay. So I should be on slide 2 now. Yeah, so this is what Marys Peak Road looked like back in 1966. It was a single lane gravel road. There was no evidence of an overlook. You can see that because of the road, there was a recent debris torrent that tore down. I think that's a tributary of Crooked Creek. So that's probably Alder Creek. There was a young conifer stand on either side of that little circle where the overlook is, that bend of the road. The consumer power line corridor went up the hill from Highway 34, and there was active construction on Highway 34 south of the overlook. 1970, a little bit had changed. The right-of-way had been completely cleared, but the overlook itself had not yet been constructed. And then we go to 1977. Mary's Peak Road at this point is paved and it's 2 lanes. The overlook construction has been completed, and actually just to the left of that circle, there's a little evidence of a washout from the road just to the west of the overlook. Okay. So we'll try to zoom in here and take a quick little animated overlay. So this is the overlook in 66, Young Forest Stand adjacent to that bend of the road, no overlook yet, single lane road. Here we are, 1970. The entire right-of-way has been cleared up and down the side slopes, but still no construction. 1977, we've got the overlook there. The road at this point, 2 lanes, and looking pretty nice at that point. And that forest stand is starting to get bigger. And just for comparison, here is 2016. And 2016, all the right-of-way trees have grown in, so that right-of-way is considerably thinner. And the trees right around the overlook itself are towering over the overlook, so much so that they're shading out the parking area right there. So let's go to here. So what you're looking at here, that brown square of BLM land, that's the BLM ownership parcel in section 3 with the Mary's Peak Road going across there. And just to tell you a little bit of timeline about what we had planned here and how this sort of came about is back before 1995, we were under an old management plan, and that old management plan did have visual resource values that were protected along high visible roads like this. So no treatment was ever taken off the corner of that ridge, and that was also in part because the forest age class at that point was just too young. After 1994, with the Northwest Forest Plan that both the Forest Service and the BLM were following, we started to coordinate on watershed analyses in 1995 and include some of our stakeholders like the watershed councils, and we started to think about and ask questions about, hey, what about that overlook that used to be there? What are we going to do? 1998. The BLM considered what's called an LSR treatment. LSR is an acronym for Late Successional Reserve. And that's a land use allocation that was under the Northwest Forest Plan. And we thought, well, maybe we could do something with an ecologically motivated intention there to open up around that area and hopefully restore the overlook. We ran into a few hurdles with that. And we had some very limited staffing issues at that point as well. So that project just kind of dropped at that point. It did come back up again, both internally and some of our external partners mentioned it, but it wasn't until 2016 where BLM got a new resource management plan approved, and it had similar land use allocations like LSR, similar treatment objectives. So in this case, this land use area was LSR, and LSR under the 2016 RMP plan had broader treatment objectives that also considered recreation along the road itself to protect recreational values. So by 2019, we had a plan. We were going to do something with some ecological objectives there, creating a little gap along that particular spot along the shoulder of the road there. That would include a little bit of snag creation and taking out some fish logs from a 3-acre little area there that you can see highlighted just off the road, the bend of that road. 2022, we finally got to a treatment plan where that contract was implemented, and phase 1 was completed by 2023. So let's jump to the next slide here. What you're looking at in this case is a little bit more zoomed in. You see the perimeter of the treatment boundary, that's the 3 acres. You're looking at a LiDAR vegetation map that tracks both the shape of the vegetation canopies as well as their height. So lighter green colors are are smaller, shorter trees. As you get darker green, you get to taller trees. As you get to a little blue-green and finally blue and even a couple of specks of maroon, you get to some really tall trees. But right there in front of the parking area, downslope of the parking area, we were hoping that we could do an ecologically based treatment there. And so that was going to involve some snag creation with some of the bigger trees beyond that are larger than 24 inches in diameter. We might create about 30 snags in that 3 acres. And then of course we'd need to do a fair amount of felling, 7 to 24-inch trees. We would focus treating those and pulling those out of the view shed corridors that I've got highlighted there. We might take up to 160 trees. There'd still be some scattered green trees. And then again, having felled a good number of those trees and wanting to keep within ecological objectives, those trees didn't go to the mill. They went into streams. A good number, I think over 100 trees came out of there that went to be used in the in-stream habitat work that took place in the Mill Creek watershed just to the west of the town of Alsea. We also had a problem with the slash. When you take that many trees down in a very small area, you get a lot of limbs and a lot of tops, and that creates a lot of what we call slash. A good amount of that was taken out, but we want to be able to make sure we pull that back away from the parking area. That could be a fire hazard, so close to a public road. So here's what we envision. We see a felling emphasis area in the more darker orange area, just downslope at the below the parking area. The little red points are, of course, the snag creations that are some of the bigger trees that would get snags, but not all of them. And hopefully what we get to is a post-treatment condition where we get the cleared vegetation and low shrubs right in front of the parking area. And then primarily in those view shed corridors going off to the east between 80 degrees and 120 degrees, we'd have still some standing trees, but a fair number of snags and more of the felling would have taken place in there. And then off again to the south and southwest between 190 and 210 degrees. So let's see, I will jump to the next one here. So this is just going to take a quick look at the overlook and the perspective from the overlook that we hope to achieve here. So this is looking at the overlook again from a Google Earth view, but if we were to be standing right over the top of the overlook or in the air over the top of the overlook and looking out to the east, that eastern view shed should give us a view about 80 degrees off to the top of Mount Jefferson. Swinging around to the right there, going further south, we would be able to see Three Sisters. And then further still, the last ridge line that you'd see that's far away would be the Coburg Hills. Moving farther south, the ridge line that's right in front of us, including Flat Mountain, would obstruct any view towards Eugene. So we swing a little farther to the right, and there we get the slope drops away, and you're looking out over the Crooked Creek Valley, Alsea River Valley. You can see towards Gunsight Pass and Prairie Peak in the distance there. The town of Alsea would be out there as well, but it would be kind of shielded from the shoulder of Old Blue Mountain. Okay, so this is pre-treatment. This, I think, was from 2019. It's a Bing Street Maps view that you can probably see if you went to Bing Maps and looked at it right now. And that's pre-treatment view. And you just get a hint of a little southeast view through the trees there to the right. This is 3 days ago. This is the post-treatment view of phase 1. We're not complete, but we got phase 1 completed. We're looking east toward Highway 34. We need to do a little bit more to open up that area that's directly behind the vehicle that you see in the foreground there. And then on the very right side of the photo there, you can get a glimpse again of a view through the trees. It was cloudy that morning, so there wasn't much to see. But that area needs to be opened up as well. So here's what's next. Our phase 2 treatments are going to take place in 2024 and 2025. And we already have a service contract that's awarded. And because that award has some other items on it that are going to be dealt with before we're dealt with. It may take some time. It'll be this summer or this fall. There'll be felling in the lower end of both of those view shed corridors to open those up a little bit more. We'll get snag contract from the same service contract. We'll do the snag work there. Removing additional fish logs is a little bit uncertain. There is a need to take a few more trees out there. The watershed councils like having a source of trees, and we've got them. But that's a separate process and a separate funding request. And then we'll also need to do a little bit more about the slash there to make sure it's not too close to that parking area once we do get everything done. So that's what we hope to accomplish there. And once that's all done, then we can start talking about maybe some interpretive work that might take place along the edge of that parking lot area. So I will leave it at that. And here's my contact information. And hopefully I'll get some questions later on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. That's really exciting, and the minimum part that we were involved with was really educational for us to learn how the work that you're doing is actually making the ecology of the forest more complex, more diverse, and a more thriving forest than that densely packed, overcharged fire trap that it was. So thank you so much, and we really look forward to the next phase of the work. And we'll see you again at the Q&A
All righty.
in a little while. So let's see, let me share. No, I'm not going to share my screen now. Sorry about this. How do I get out of this? Here we go. Okay, so next up is Doug Glavich from the U.S. Forest Service, and he's going to be talking about restoring Mary's Peak Summit Meadows. So this is a question: who knew in this group of the audience that we are losing our meadows, or have been losing our meadows? And Doug Glavich is here to restore them. And Doug has been with the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Region Ecology Program for 15 years and is their area ecologist. He's based in Corvallis at the Siuslaw National Forest Supervisor's Office on OSU campus, but covers national forests across the Cascades and Coast Range of Northwest Oregon. He specializes in both lichen ecology and in meadow systems plant community classification, Oregon silver spot butterfly habitat metrics, and meadow restoration monitoring. And recently, he has worked in remote sensing, producing meadow and other special habitat maps from satellite imagery and machine learning algorithms. So again, Doug, thank you for coming, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you for the introduction, Dave. Glad to be here. Let's see. Can you see my screen yet?
Looks great.
Yes, it's great. Yep.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, so good evening. I'm basically here, as Dave said, to talk about restoration on Mary's Peak. I do a lot of meadow system stuff across the Coast Range and the Cascades. So yeah, this has been kind of an interesting process to observe, and that's kind of a lot of the role I'm in. And this is really going to kind of focus on monitoring or tracking that ecological transformation from this meadow restoration project. And before I sort of dive into that, there's certainly folks here that know Mary's Peak and its flora well, but just for some folks who might not know what's up there, there's a ton of plants, even more important ones that are listed here, but here's a handful of them. There's these native agrastis, Romer's fescue, California sedge, one of my favorites, California oatgrass. Those comprise a lot of the grasslands up there, and there's a mix of there's a handful of forbs, myanthum, strawberry, violets, There's way too many plants to list, but that's just kind of a little glimpse into some of the plants that are up there in the meadow systems. And we can sort of think about them in sort of like plant communities. These are kind of very, very simplified versions. There's several plant communities up there, but certainly when you're up there, you can see a lot of sort of this California sedge dominated grassland up there, and this Romer's fescue dominated. Those are probably the two obvious ones that you might see. And those are also indicative of conditions, environmental site conditions. You tend to get the California sedge on kind of the relatively more moist or mesic sites that can be often on north and east slopes, can be on other aspects if the soil conditions are right. And Romer's fescue really is indicating when that comes to dominance, you're really on kind of on those south slopes or really dry sites, often shallower soils. And you can see within those, you know, if you kind of get rid of some of the green blurs, there's a few plant communities within those, and they formed sort of some patchwork in there, mosaic. They also integrate with each other a little bit. It's a little complex. You can see there's a moisture gradient, but you can even see in places where California sedge is gradiating in with Romer's fescue until it comes too dry. So it's a little complex up there. And so besides some of those environmental site conditions that drive how this vegetation operates up there, it's also some of those patterns are also from historic disturbance. And if you caught any of the presentations from the last Mary's Peak evening, you'll see that there was a lot of activity up there and lots of people up there, lots of cars, so lots of disturbance, and some patterns we may see if there could be a remnant of some of that disturbance. So the need for restoration. Yeah, lots of folks have been, have looked at this through time. Certainly Zald sort of published a paper looking at sort of declining meadows in the Coast Range across those high summits. And on Mary's Peak found that there was about a 35% loss since the 40s of meadow vegetation, and it was mostly from forest encroachment. So kind of one of the first steps to looking at restoration is to sort of identify those encroached stands. If you can, hopefully you can see some of those sort of delineated patches on there. They're color coded by ownership. The blue sort of patches are City of Corvallis. There's a little BLM section over there. That orange delineated on the sort of on the east side. And then there's the Siuslaw, which is most of those green patches. So there's individual trees and forest stands. Patches that have been identified have encroached since the 40s. And we're looking at being removed. And I think most of those Siuslaw National Forest identified trees have now been removed. And so that was kind of the first step, is identifying those and looking at those patches. But of course, some of those forest stands are big enough that they really required some logging operation to remove some of those stands. And so in reopening these meadows, of course we needed to monitor them, and there's a before and after shot, but we've got a lot of monitoring questions. We definitely want to track the vegetation trajectory. We want to understand, of course, invasive plants, what that response looks like, but we don't really know that much about meadow vegetation and response to disturbance in the Coast Range. There's been a little bit of work in the Cascades, but not really much in the Coast Range. So this is an opportunity to take advantage of that, of the data coming off of the monitoring for this work. I'm not going to belabor the monitoring methodology, but just know that there's these kind of transect lines that go in and out of those forest stands that were removed in those particular locations. And there are these meter by meter plots that all the vegetation data were collected. And basically percent cover of all plant species were recorded before the trees were removed. And then right after the trees were removed, and generally roughly every couple years, the data was collected post tree removal. And I'll share a couple of results, just so we can get a glimpse of what's going on. But before I do that, I'll just sort of define a couple of groups for the next chart. Is that there's this forest species group, and those are plants that are typically more associated with forested plant communities, and so they're found in the understory. You generally don't find them out in the meadows. And then there's the forest and meadow species group. These are species that they have the ability to operate in both forested and meadow environments, being that the conditions are right. And then there are species that are indicative of persistent sort of meadow vegetation environments. And these are species that you pretty much won't find for the most part, in forest stands. So looking at some brief results here in the context of species richness, which is the number of species. We're doing this number of species by those forest vegetation, or those vegetation groups. And the data comes from, if you can see it, there are these kind of yellow outline patches up in the corner of the slide. And those are the locations where we have about 8 years of data collection. And so that's where the data is summarized across those 3 sites. So, and the blue bar there in the chart, that's data coming off before the trees were removed. And of course, we would expect that forest species are the most abundant in that year before the trees are removed. And then after we remove the trees, then we start to see sort of slowly through time that forest species are starting to decline little by little, till about, and then it starts to, those high values start to shrink in that 8 year. And basically meadow species are starting to increase slowly. And then by 8 years, we're getting more high values in cover of or species richness in those groups. So basically what we're seeing here is we are seeing that trajectory of meadow vegetation developing across these units. So that's basically the desired condition. So that's what we're looking for. So that's good. So that's one thing we know, is that we're going in the right direction. And it's not happening overnight, right? So it's at 8 years and it's still going up. It hasn't plateaued yet. So we're still learning how vegetation comes back after you remove the trees. So another thing I wanted to know is what's coming back. If in particular sites, if you've got meadow vegetation coming back, what's coming back? In this particular site, here's an example of that appendix meadow. There's got native agrostis, California sedge, blue wild rye. You've got some strawberry, blue wild rye creeping in there, and a lot of those higher cover values are coming in around in that year 8, so that they're still developing and coming in. But we have a lot of good meadow species coming in those areas where the trees were removed. So, and I might point out that we don't have time to dive into all the different sites, but not every one of those sites looks like this. There are different species coming in different levels of cover and diversity, depending on sort of site conditions and other factors on the landscape. And of course, weeds are is obviously that's a pretty big deal and important to monitor. And we can see here these are these are kind of the weeds that are really coming in across those 3 units that we had 8 years of data, where we removed the trees. And you can see that these are all detected in those sites, but you can see the cover is very, very low. Even the most abundant cover there is still less than 1%. And you can see where it kind of blips up and drops down in a couple of those. And the reason for that is really because there's this feedback loop. So part of this monitoring, once the data comes back, if there's a weed issue, and oftentimes the surveyor will get a hold of me and let me know if there is a serious weed issue. But the data, once we see the data and there's some weeds coming in, that gets reported immediately to Science Law Botany, and then botany dispatches out to weed treatment. So they're staying on top of it. So this important sort of monitoring feedback loop of monitoring, reporting, and treatment is pretty important in keeping those weeds in check. So that's kind of that monitoring summary part. Just wanted to, there wasn't enough time to really dive into it, but I think we kind of got a flavor of what's happening up there. We do have trees that are, or we have plants, those vegetation sites are moving in the direction of meadow plant communities in general. And we're able to keep invasive plant presence low because of this sort of monitoring and feedback loop. So that's that part of it. And the next step is I'm going to jump into sort of the weed treatment and vegetation management, and this is really all kind of this is all really kind of operated by Matt Smith. He's the restoration botanist, or one of the restoration botanists for the Central Coast Ranger District, and covers Mary's Peak. And yeah, Science Lineup Botany, they really kind of do a lot of the work and they're on the ground, you know, especially like sort of post big treatment, you know, once that any of those vegetation needs, they're kind of dealing with the weed treatment, plant materials, seeding, those sorts of things. And, you know, a lot of the work up on the peak is also conducted with by Institute for Applied Ecology. There's an agreement with the Siuslaw National Forest. They're kind of utilizing Institute for Applied Ecology's expertise in meadow restoration, weed treatment, kind of all things meadows. They've got a lot of expertise in that realm, so it's kind of a good partnership, and they're really kind of helping moving a lot of this ecological restoration along. And there's a bit of treatment that's happening pretty much across the peak, but in some places there's more than others. And some of these locations, it might just be along the road, keeping, because there are quite a bit of weeds right along the roads that are kind of brought up by humans, and so they're just ready. Roadside weeds are ready to jump onto any kind of disturbed site. They're in the meadow, so there's some kind of treatment going on across the peak. And one thing that the botanists are focusing on is really kind of an integrated pest management approach to weed control, which basically means they're using multiple tools. So they're not necessarily just applying herbicide. They're also doing manual removal, and they're also using a steam, kind of a weed steamer. There's actually a photo there of Rolando from Institute for Applied Ecology steaming some invasive plants. So yeah, it's an integrated approach using multiple tools to really get the best tool for the weed and the infestation. So, and this next example is kind of really about that feedback loop. So in the monitoring of an area, this is not in those tree removal areas, but kind of it was part of one of the operations that were pulling trees off of one of the units, that there was some disturbance that happened. But anyway, some rat-tailed fescue that was, we think must have been roadside, escaped and kind of very quickly created a big patch in the meadow, kind of mowing, taking over sites. So that was quickly reported to Matt, and so he dispatched out a tech to go up there and treatment. So that rat-tailed fescue got removed. Now I'm kind of going into some ongoing vegetation management they're doing up there, and this is kind of focusing on a lot of stuff that's maybe outside of some of those restoration. Those stands are removed. There's a lot of roadside weeds as well, and so some of the focal species are like oxeye daisy. And here's a map of the treatment area. It's a lot of roadside stuff, but there's a patch there that's off road a little bit, some around the parking lot, and kind of wraps around up to the summit. And then there's this creeping velvet grass, which is actually quite bad. I've seen the infestation up there before the first treatment, and it definitely kind of creates a big, thick thatch mat that kind of just basically kills all the native plants in its path. And so there's the treatment areas mapped out there for that. So they're keeping tabs on treating that particular weed. And another thing that's they're doing up there is aside from weeds, there's the forest does encroach from the edges, and so the Institute for Applied Ecology is organizing sort of annual tree removal work to pull these invading trees out so we can kind of keep these meadows in place. Another thing is there's sort of a user created trail that comes off of that Summit Road, and has quite a few impacts. That trail there's trampled native plants, there's soil compaction, there's invasive plants they're taking advantage of that disturbance along that trail, and there's a lot of weeds up along that trail. So yeah, so that they're looking at that trail, and one of the things that they're looking at is maybe the viability at rerouting the trail, but kind of just sort of assessing that situation right now. And in any case, Matt and IAE, Institute for Applied Ecology, they're collecting a lot of seed right now to kind of build their plant materials up there to potentially treat this site and other disturbed areas on the peak. So they've got the right species and genetics mix for the summit. Anyway, that's kind of that restoration piece in a nutshell. I thank everybody for listening.
Well, thank you, Doug. That was great, and that was really enlightening. I learned a lot from that, so I appreciate it. So we'll see you in a few minutes after the final presentation. And the final presentation is an old friend of mine. She's not old. I mean, we've been friends for a while now since she started. Michelle Holman is the district ranger for the Central Coast Ranger District and the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Area on the Siuslaw National Forest. She is responsible for the management of all the lands that fall within the Ranger District boundary, which includes Mary's Peak. She wanted to be the district ranger in Walport since she was in forestry school at OSU and is honored to be in this position for 12 years. And she is going to give the talk about reducing the Mary's Peak communication site. And the moment we met was when she first took over, and it was just about the same subject, and now she's really pulled it off. So thank you, Michelle. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Dave. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, hello, everyone. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the Mary's Peak communication site that sits on the top of the summit. Let's see, is it gonna? Okay, so the communication site started being a communication site around 1915 when a fire lookout was staged at the top of Mary's Peak, and there was a phone line that ran from the peak down to the water intake, which is now within I'm not sure which water intake, but it's within the city of Corvallis watershed. They have 3 intakes now, so I'm not sure which one, but it was done through just kind of camping at the top of the peak in a tent. And if anybody's been in got caught in a storm in the spring or summer or even the fall on Mary's Peak, knows how incredibly tremendously impactful those storms can be. And so they built a actual fire lookout. And so this lookout on the left here, I'm not sure, it's not dated, but it looks like it's probably close to one of the first lookouts that was built on the peak. And the lookout stayed there, and you can see on the right-hand side here that that's probably close to what it looked like before it was removed in 1972. So the communication started as a fire lookout, and at some point in time, there's a decision made that the communications was important, but maybe a fire lookout wasn't critical at the time. So here's what the peak looks like today. You can see the folks walking around on the road up to the communications site on the I think that's the east side of it. They're kind of hanging out, looking at the view. There's a picnic table up there, and then you have this lovely communication site with a fence around it. I just what provides us direction on how we manage that communication site, and it's the Sisoila Land and Resource Management Plan, which was amended in 1994 by the Northwest Forest Plan, and that document is a little dated. It was originally the original Land and Resource Management Plan was signed in 1990, so it's pretty dated, but it has definitely some direction on the appropriateness of the communication site up on Mary's Peak. In the section on Management Area 8, which is the special interest areas, Mary's Peak is a special interest area, and so it talks about using that as a communication site, but it also talks about minimizing that site where possible, kind of minimizing the impacts of that site. So in 2016, in comes the Bonneville Power Administration. I should say that communication site has as many occupants, not just the Forest Service, the Bonneville Power Administration, the BLM. There's several emergency management organizations that have communications up on Mary's Peak. And so in 1960, the Bonneville Power Administration hosted their communication facilities up there. So, and that communication network is key to the safety and reliability of the BPA power transmission lines. And I think, after this recent ice storm we had this winter, I think the critical infrastructure was really clear, or how important that infrastructure was clear in maintaining our power lines. So the BPA did a review of their communication equipment and building up at Mary's Peak and determined that it was a bit outdated, and it needed to be upgraded. And the building itself was in pretty rough shape. It's the weather up there is pretty hard on buildings, and so the roof leaks and all that kind of stuff. So in September of 2016, BPA went out to the public with a proposal to address their inadequate communication equipment. And then they went out to the public again in January of 2018. By 2021, all the environmental assessments were completed, and they published the final environmental assessment. And then the Forest Service adopted the analysis. BPA did the analysis, and through a decision notice and a finding of no significant impact, we basically adopted the analysis and made a decision notice off of that on August 24th of 2022. So what was the decision is the question, right? So here's the communication site again. In the yellow box is the BPA communication site that co-hosts the BLM. There's a building there, and there you can see a small tower. And so the decision is to remove that building and that tower, and just take it off the site, and then build a new building with upgraded equipment and a bit of a higher tower where the X is. So, and then you can see the fencing around. The fencing's about 12 years old. That was put in for, there used to be some satellite dishes at the top of the peak. And so, people, used to climb up on the satellite dishes and, look at the view and look at the stars at night. And it wasn't very safe, and it wasn't very good on the satellite dishes. And then we had some break-ins in the buildings and stuff like that. So the fence went up. And you can see this is a different angle from the fence. This is what the fence looks like close up. And then right in front in the middle of the slide is the BPA building and their tower. So one of the probably the best things that's come out of this proposal, or this intention of building a new building up on communication site for BPA, is the adjusting of the fences. So the green and orange is where the existing fence is, and the decision is to move that fence and basically shrink that comm site by not quite half, but pretty close to half, and then it would be revegetated. Yeah, so all that area will be available to the public to, picnic and do whatever they enjoy up on top of the peak. So there is a mitigation action plan. It's 8 pages long. It's pretty big, and one of the things that was the themes that we made sure BPA was aware of, and I think the public made them aware pretty quick, is that Mary's Peak is a really special place to a lot of the communities in Corvallis and Alsea, and just everyone that comes and enjoys the peak. And so doing things like building a new building and removing a building and changing a fence and all that kind of stuff is going to disturb a lot of those recreation opportunities for while it's going on. And there's a lot of environmental concern with the rock gardens that were fairly close to the comm site, and just like you heard Doug just say, kind of the fragile nature, the importance of those plant communities. And so I've been pretty impressed with BPA and their mitigation action plan. The one thing that I've seen that I haven't seen before, well, there's 2 things. One is that BPA is going to do a pre-construction public meeting and invite the local landowners, the land managers, Benton County, and all the other organizations that have communications up on the peak, and talk with the contractors and staff, and find out what's really, get people's information, contact information, so they can, engage in conversations about what's going on, discuss concerns, and then address them. So that's when this starts. Hopefully there'll be no unaware. Everyone will be aware when it's happening. The other thing that typically happens in a project like this is that there would be a contractor, and then the contractor would have a project manager on site to make sure that they're meeting all the requirements of the contract. One of the things that BPA decided to do because of the public input is to hire an on-site environmental monitor that's not associated with the contractor, and that would be on-site during the outdoor construction, to make sure that all the mitigation measures and BMPs are implemented correctly. So that's I think that's a really great measure to ensure that things like the rock garden and other things are really well protected. And then some of the other things that there's a lot of mitigation action that will take place related to just protection of the resources. one of the ones that I think is great is just using the plant materials sourced only from Mary's Peak and the West Point spur for vegetation. And I know that we've also gathered seeds from that area that we're going to grow out at a nursery and make sure we have enough materials for that. So what's next? The environmental assessment's been completed, but if you've been up to Mary's Peak lately, you'll see that nothing has really taken place in terms of construction. So the next step is that the Forest Service will receive engineering designs from BPA. The Forest Service engineers will take a look at those and then approve them, and then we'll get started. Right now, we have not all this was done to update the special use permit that BPA holds for the communication site on National Forest. And until the engineering designs are completed and received and approved, they don't have an updated communication permit. So as soon as we get those designs, we'll issue the permit. And so the next thing is that will be obvious to the public will be when they invite people to have a conversation in the pre-construction phase, and then they will get started. So that's what's happening on the comm side on the top of on the summit, and just the things you can can expect to see whenever BPA hasn't given us a timeline for when they're going to start working on those engineering designs. They're having some workforce issues, just like so many of us are right now. So that's where we sit.
Thank you, Michelle. That was really helpful. That was very helpful I assume for everybody, but it was for me. So if everybody can
Sure.
come back on, Bonnie and Scott and Kathleen, Doug, have a cast of thousands up here. And then Bonnie's going to get to real work here, going through some of the questions. And I hope everybody who had a question is asking a question. So let's see, I know I saw one of them, and I'm not sure I can answer it, the first one. Bonnie, are you there? Or let's see. If Bonnie doesn't come on, I'll just read it. So Chris said, where is the picture taken that shows Mary's Peak in the background and a river in the foreground? It was shown several times in the intro just now. Well, the intro was mine. So I'm taking that. I will have to go back. I'm not sure which one that is. I would say it must be the picture taken by Barry Wolf. That it looks like a river's in front of it, but it's actually the wastewater pools from the from Philomath. And it looks like pristine, clean water, with birds in it. And it's actually one of my favorite views of Mary's Peak, is when you don't know where it's from, it's really quite stunning. You look like you're at a Cascade Lake. But I know Chris, so Chris, let's talk about that later and see if I answered your question correctly. Okay, Bonnie, take it away.
And so Dave, my computer completely froze and I had to leave and come back, and it completely deleted the Q&A for me.
Okay, well,
So I can't see any questions. So if people either want to resubmit, or if you want to try to take a few of them, I have 0 questions in my queue.
Okay,
I'm so
I
sorry.
have them right in front of me right now.
Sorry.
And I need to tell everybody, this is the first time that Bonnie's computer has frozen.
Yeah, it wouldn't respond at all. Sorry.
Every time we have somebody's computer freeze, but this is the first time it's in Bonnie's, and Bonnie's, it's about time it was you.
Yeah, I was
So
like, it had to
thank
happen
you. It had to
sometime.
happen.
I was
All
so
right.
panicked that I ended the whole event, so I'm glad I didn't do that.
Okay, well, thank you. And Scott, this question is for you. It's a hardball question, And you have other people backing you up here if you need any help. John asks, given wonderful views from the summit, why spend money on the overlook you described?
Okay. Can you hear me all right, Dave?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So first, I'll sort of answer that in two ways. First, the Ridgeline Overlook is a site that has existing infrastructure, that very nice rock walled pullout, and that'll continue to be maintained. So, and that site itself is also an opportunity to add an interpretive education component to it. So it's just a nice site right there. And then the other part of that answer is this treatment, what I described, that's just off the shoulder of that pullout, is not really designed as a viewpoint creation. It's really one of several ecologically driven treatment patches that are occurring across BLM lands in that vicinity. And in fact, this area here, that section of BLM land, has a couple other patches right in that parcel. They're just not visible from the road. So, and the thing about it is that BLM typically gets a small budget each year for habitat restoration treatments that are like this. And we sometimes match those treatments by gathering what I call fish logs to be used for in-stream habitat restoration. And so when we're able to kind of, match some of those objectives and stretch those restoration dollars a little further by sort of combining them in a project like this. Yeah, there's great views at the summit, and we're doing some treatments that are on the land. Let's put one right next to the viewpoint, and maybe we'll get a little bit of a view shed from that spot. So that's the thinking behind that.
Okay, thank you. And here's a follow-up question, and I'm going to add a little thing to it so people are more clear. There's a question from Steve about how does wood removal from the area streams jibe with watershed goals of adding wood to material. So I think if you can clarify two things, back to the former question, if you can clarify what just a couple of ecological values are from the treatment, and then secondly, define what you meant by fish logs, because I think people think that there was already logs in a stream.
Right.
So
right.
could those two, if you can,
growing on them.
those two,
Right.
yeah, if you can define those two issues there.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things we know is that as Kathleen was mentioning, we've lost a lot of that wood structure out of the streams, and our fisheries biologists and hydrologists have worked for a couple decades now to solely kind of improve that situation and work back from that. And so in this site that I mentioned, and I hope I didn't misspeak, but maybe I did. When I say fish logs, what we actually did is we took we took those trees that were growing in a terrestrial upland location. We felled them, and then we hauled them up to the road, put them on a truck, and carted them down the road so that they could be used as an in-stream project, putting that wood back into stream. So when we need to put wood in the stream, sometimes we pull those logs, those trees over that are right next to the stream. But a lot of times we go out to other places where we have a source of logs that's not going to impair the riparian area itself. We get those logs from another location, an upland location, and we put those into the stream. So that's one of the aspects of what we call fish logs. And then the other thing there is that these ecologically driven treatments that are happening in upland forests that are what I call late successional forest, we typically do those in treatments of stands that are not quite old forest. They're mid-cereal forest. And what happens with a mid-cereal forest, with Douglas fir in particular, is they shade out everything that's underneath them. And if there's like old growth remnants, old trees, and then one's standing up here and you got all these young trees coming up around it, they start to shade out the remnant tree itself. And that remnant tree is then competing for sunlight, competing for soil moisture, competing for growing space because the wind blows around and they knock branches off. So we will open up around those and try to restore that older component that's still on the landscape and is really important to biological diversity on a lot of different levels in those stands. And so creating little openings in a fairly uniform stand that doesn't have that is important. It restores a shrub community. It It restores the invertebrates that feast on the shrubs. It helps with the songbirds that then come in and feed on those invertebrates. So just by trying to help with the little nuggets of diversity that are out there and enhance those and restore those is kind of the main emphasis of some of these restoration treatments that we're doing in the uplands.
Great, thank you, Scott. So biodiversity over monoculture, right?
I'd like to add a little bit to that too, from the Watershed Council perspective. It's very helpful. We have really close partnerships with both BLM and Forest Service when they are conducting those ecological restoration practices. We are able to then receive those logs, which is a huge piece of our in-stream restoration work, when we can put those logs into the stream and re-engage the floodplain. It's very expensive to try to purchase logs. So those partnerships where we can receive those logs that are geared for or slated for restoration is a huge component of the projects that we put together, and often features as match to cash awards that were given for grant funds that require that kind of cash match. So it's really a full circle situation when those can be used for our restoration projects.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. And thank you to John and Steve for those questions that really brought up some important issues, your questions. So Charlene asked, why did the meadows become encroached by trees? Was this formerly managed by native peoples or snowfields? Won't this be impacted further by climate change? So I guess, Doug, you get the first crack at this.
Yeah, it's sort of a complex set of drivers up there, and it's not thoroughly well understood, but it's probably complex of many of those things. One thing we do know is that it looks like there's a climate driver that maintains the meadows. Why they're encroaching at the rate? I mean, it's not a very fast rate, but within 70 years there was a 35% loss. But if that rate has increased and why that we're not totally sure of. But it looks like there's certainly a climate driver and an edaphic driver, which is soils. There's multimedial loam soils type up there on the peak, and often on many of the summit balds that contain these meadows are correlated with that particular soil. So it's relatively a little more shallow than the forest soils, and it's also, and it can be a bit more skeletal as well. So it's sort of a different soil type. And then snowpack does play a role of precipitation. It does, I think it was McGee and Antos in the 90s sort of looked at patterns of tree encroachment and climate and found that where there were, and I think they looked at age of trees that encroached and versus and tied that with climate parameters, and where there were wet summers, the dry sites had kind of more had increased encroachment. And in some places, in some areas where there may have been some late, like deeper snowpacks that carried on to some soil moisture into the summer, when those trees were ready to sort of encroach, and if they can get their seedlings out and the soil moisture is there, that kind of sort of facilitates that encroachment from the edges out in the meadows. And then also, slowly the forest also can build their sort of soil profiles out on the edge. They're sort of shading out some meadow vegetation. They're also dropping, organics onto the ground so the soils can sort of build and they can slowly kind of move out. So there's that sort of climate and soils piece. The question around sort of indigenous burning, there's some anecdotal evidence about some tribes may have done some burning up there. We don't have any concrete, but I've heard some anecdotes that some tribes may have burned up there, but we don't really have any information about frequency and the type of burns and you know, there's a lot of missing pieces on that. So they may have played a role. We don't think that fire is a main driver up there. Some of the big wildfires that have come through, I think of as Snow's 1984 work on the summit, looked into fire and didn't seem to be any evidence of fire, of any of those big fires kind of rolling up over the meadows. I think Kevin Bruce's map from the last presentation evening kind of showed, I think, the Equina fire kind of coming up the peak, but not really into the meadows. So we think that, yeah, there could be a possibility of tribal fire at least contributing, but we don't really have any information around how that played out. As far as like climate change issues, yeah, climate will certainly have some sort of effect up there. If we get some of those, because right now the projections for the Coast Range is is in the next sort of mid-century to end of century projections are looking at some droutier, warmer summers, but also some sort of stochastic winter events where we may get some high precip and there could be some really high precip events in some winters, and maybe even potentially some snowpack here and there. So if you get some of those, if we do get any sort of those timed precipitation events that create some of those wet soils, we may see some more tree encroachment. In areas where we have drought, you might have meadow plant communities shifting from some of those maybe mesic moist types like the California sedge may kind of convert more over to Romer's fescue if you get more drought. So you may have some plant communities shifting to more drought communities. So it's kind of a complex situation and kind of a complex answer to that question. So hopefully that was kind of getting at it.
It's a little bit of everything, and we don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, there's some,
Something
people
like that.
looking into it, and there's
Yeah,
people looking around at this stuff, and there's, some data-driven answers, but there's
Right.
some pieces of that are not clear.
Well, one of our interpretive guys told us he had found some articles from the 1930s of some OSU professors going up there and measuring the snow, and they were measuring 35 feet of accumulated snow. Now if we have 5 feet, it's a good year.
Yeah.
That sort of shows some changes. So thank you. And Greg you also just answered Greg's question. So we'll move on. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Anonymous asked, wait a minute, yeah. What determines if steam or herbicide method used in the control weeds? No, what determines which one you use? Okay, I read it wrong. On whether to use steam or herbicide methods. And the second question is riparian area more likely to get steam method? Doug?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. The weed treatment arena is not quite mine, but I have chatted with Matt and Rolando and some of those folks about this a little bit. What I kind of, they would probably provide the best answer, but from what I would gather, I would say that I think they've tested it out on several weed species, and so I think there's a little bit of that. If it does seem to be that, I think if steaming is the effective way, then that's what they use. So I think if they can get away with using steam or manual pull, that's what they use. If those methods prove ineffective at controlling the weed species, then they would go to herbicide. That would be that's my
Okay.
my guess of it.
Okay, Kathleen or Scott, do you have anything to add to that on that question?
I think Doug's got it. Yeah,
Agree.
that's my recollection as well. I've got a botanist here that does similar type work, and that's what I recall as well.
Okay. Well, I have been up there when I see a whole bunch of people manually removing, and so I mean, you're using all kinds of methods. So I appreciate that. I'm going to answer Jim's question quickly. He said, "Has the picnic table on the peak been removed?" Yes, it has. Thank you, Jim. And that was years in the coming. So thank you. Many years in the coming. So I appreciate that question. So with that, we are now at a time, and I want to thank each and every one of you for your talk tonight. And this has been very exciting, very educational for me. I've learned a lot. I'm excited to hear about, the fact that we're going to have only half the size of the BPA. I mean, half the size of the communication site. We're going to have a new diverse cereal forest and a wonderful lookout to go along with it. We're going to have more meadows with native plants on it. And the streams are going to be running through all kinds of woody material and with all kinds of fish in it. So thank you to each and every one of you. And Bonnie, thank you for hosting. Once again, stellar job. And I hope to see all of you on May 9th, because you're going to now start hearing about the future and how you can play a role in this future. And I think you found that from Michelle, the general public had a big impact on getting a better result on the BPA tower communication site. And so stay tuned. Thank you very much. See you next time, everybody.
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks,
Take
everybody.
care.
Good night.